Blood tastes exactly like old pennies. I learned that the hard way when my car wrapped around a utility pole, my chest crushed against the steering wheel while I died as my family's disgraced outcast. All because I tried to save my sister from her toxic lie. Now, I'm sitting in the same sterile kitchen, smelling the same burnt toast, watching her unwrap a stolen positive pregnancy test. This time, I'm pouring myself a cup of black coffee. I'm going to sit back and watch her burn. My fingers were trembling. Not a delicate, cinematic quiver, but a violent, jerky spasm that rattled the ceramic coffee mug against the granite countertop. A second ago, I was bleeding out on the asphalt. The rain had been freezing, mixing with the hot, sticky fluid leaking from my temple. I remembered the awful, hollow crunch of metal, the smell of burning rubber, the absolute, crushing loneliness of dying while knowing my own mother had blocked my phone number. And now, there was only the low, steady hum of the refrigerator. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my palms flat against the cold stone counter until the edges bit into my skin. I breathed in stale coffee, faint bleach, the sickeningly sweet strawberry vape juice my sister Madison always puffed indoors despite our lease agreement. I opened my eyes. The digital clock on the microwave read 8:14 a.m., June 12th. It was exactly 1 year ago. I wasn't dead. I was back. The realization didn't come with a chorus of angels or a sudden burst of heroic clarity. It came with bile rising in the back of my throat. I staggered to the kitchen sink and dry heaved, staring down the drain, listening to the water drip. I pressed a hand to my ribs, expecting the pulverized bone I'd felt in my final moments. Nothing, just the soft cotton of my oversized sleep shirt. Footsteps padded down the hallway, bare feet slapping against the cheap laminate flooring. Hazel? Madison's voice. It had that pitchy, breathless quality she always used when she was about to perform. I turned around, leaning heavily against the sink. I wiped my mouth with the back of my hand. There she was, my younger sister, the golden child. Her blonde hair was twisted into a messy bun that probably took her 20 minutes to perfect. She was wearing silk pajama shorts and a ratty collegiate t-shirt, clutching something behind her back. Her eyes were wide, brimming with a manufactured panic that I used to mistake for vulnerability. "What's wrong with you?" she asked, her nose wrinkling as she looked at my pale face. "You look like you're going to puke." "Just didn't sleep well," I managed to say. My voice sounded like gravel, raw, unused. "Well, wake up. I need you." She stepped closer, the strawberry scent rolling off her in a cloying wave. She pulled her hand from behind her back and slammed a slender plastic stick onto the counter next to my coffee mug. "Look." I didn't need to look. I knew what it was. A pregnancy test. 2 solid pink lines. In my past life, I had reacted exactly how a good sister should. I had gasped. I had hugged her. I had asked what Declan, her wealthy, emotionally distant boyfriend of 6 months, was going to say. And then, 3 days later, I had found the Craigslist email receipt on her open laptop, proving she had bought the positive test from a pregnant stranger for $50 to trap him into marriage. When I confronted her then, I was frantic. I begged her not to ruin her life, not to trap a man with a lie. I threatened to tell him. Madison had simply smiled, cried on command, and went straight to our parents and Declan, telling them I was insanely jealous of her new life, that I had tried to push her down the stairs to cause a miscarriage, and that I was having a psychotic break. They believed her. Why wouldn't they? She was the sweet, fragile Madison. I was the abrasive, independent Hazel, who always had a chip on her shoulder. They cut me off entirely. When I died, I hadn't spoken to a single family member in 9 months. I stared at the plastic stick. The 2 pink lines stared back. "I'm pregnant," Madison whispered. She forced a tear to well up in her left eye. It was genuinely impressive. "Hazel, what am I going to do?" "Declan, we've been fighting so much lately. He was talking about moving to London for his firm. If I tell him, he might think I did it on purpose." I looked at her face. Really looked at it. I saw the slight twitch at the corner of her mouth, the calculation behind the wet, doe-like eyes. She was testing the waters, rehearsing her lines on her built-in understudy. My chest tightened. A ghost of the car crash impact squeezed my lungs. I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab the mug of hot coffee and throw it against the wall. I wanted to wrap my hands around her shoulders and shake her until her teeth rattled. Instead, I swallowed hard. I let my facial muscles go slack. "Wow," I said softly. I picked up the stick by the edge, careful not to touch the part she had allegedly peed on. I knew it wasn't her urine anyway. "Are you sure? I've taken 3. She lied smoothly, wiping the single tear away. "Hazel, I'm terrified." I put the test down. I picked up my mug. The coffee was lukewarm, bitter as ash. I took a slow sip, letting the caffeine hit my empty stomach with a dull ache. "Don't be terrified," I said, my voice deadpan. "Declan comes from old money. He has a massive trust. He's not going to let his heir grow up in a broken home. You know how his family is about reputation." Madison paused. She blinked, thrown off by my clinical response. Last time, I had offered to go with her to a clinic. I had offered to help her figure out her career. "You think he'll marry me?" she asked, the fake panic dropping just a fraction of an inch to reveal the cold greed underneath. "I think he won't have a choice," I replied. I offered her a small, tight smile. "You should tell Mom and Dad tonight. We're supposed to go over for dinner anyway, right? Bring him. Do it there." Her eyes lit up. The validation was a drug, and I had just handed her a loaded syringe. "You think so? A family dinner?" "Yes, that's perfect. He won't be able to get mad or pull away if Mom and Dad are right there crying." "Exactly," I said. I turned away from her, walking toward the sink to rinse my mug. The ceramic clinked sharply against the metal basin. I gripped the edge of the sink, feeling the cold water splash onto my wrists. "Thanks, Hayes," she chirped from behind me, her tone instantly lighter, the terror evaporating into thin air. I heard the scrape of the plastic test being scooped off the counter. "I knew I could count on you. I'm going to go call him." She hurried out of the kitchen. I stood there for a long time, watching the coffee grounds swirl down the drain. I wasn't the good sister anymore. The good sister died bleeding out on a dark highway. If Madison wanted to build a house out of matches, I wasn't going to hide the gasoline. I was just going to step out of the blast radius. Our parents' house always smelled heavily of lemon pledge and roasting meat on Sundays. It was a stifling suburban smell that settled in the back of your throat. Sitting at the heavy mahogany dining table, I dragged the tines of my silver fork across the surface of my mashed potatoes. The metallic scrape was loud against the porcelain plate, a sharp counterpoint to the drone of our father, Arthur, talking about his golf handicap. I was wearing a dark, heavy sweater. Despite it being June, I felt like I was constantly shivering. My skin hadn't forgotten the cold of the pavement. Madison sat across from me, radiant in a pastel blue sundress, that subtly emphasized her chest and hid her flat stomach. Next to her sat Declan Hayes. He looked exactly as I remembered him from the before. Sharp jawline, dark hair perfectly swept back, expensive watch catching the light from the chandelier. He wore a navy cashmere polo that looked soft to the touch, but his posture was rigid. He had one hand resting on the table, his knuckles slightly white. He didn't want to be here. He had been pulling away from Madison for weeks, tired of her constant demands for attention and her subtle manipulations. The London transfer was his escape hatch. He took a sip of his red wine. It was a 2015 Bordeaux my father had opened specifically to impress him. Declan looked like he was drinking cough syrup. So Declan, my mother, Beatrice, started, dabbing at the corners of her mouth with a linen napkin. Madison mentioned you were looking at flats in Kensington. Are you really thinking of moving across the pond? The table went quiet. The trap was set. Declan cleared his throat, adjusting his collar. It looked entirely too tight on him. Ah, yes, Mrs. Miller. The firm is expanding its European division. They've offered me a junior partner position to spearhead it. It's a very demanding opportunity. He didn't look at Madison when he said it. He looked at my father. He was laying the groundwork for a clean break. I'm too busy for your daughter. That's quite far, my father grunted, slicing into his prime rib. Blood pooled on his plate. What about Madison? Dad, Madison said softly, placing a manicured hand over Declan's rigid wrist. Declan and I have actually been talking about that. No, they hadn't. Declan flinched slightly at her touch, but he didn't pull away. He was too polite, too well-bred to make a scene at Sunday dinner. Actually, Madison continued, her voice trembling perfectly. She looked down at her lap, then up at Declan, her eyes shining. I don't think London is a good idea right now. For either of us. Declan frowned, turning his head to look at her. Madison, we discussed this. It's my career. I know, she whispered. A single tear slipped down her cheek, catching the chandelier light. But we have something else to think about now. She reached into her designer purse, sitting on the floor beside her, and pulled out the white plastic stick. She placed it right in the center of the table, next to the gravy boat. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was suffocating. It felt like all the oxygen had been vacuumed out of the dining room. My mother dropped her fork. It clattered against her plate. My father stopped chewing. But I was only watching Declan. I expected to see joy, or maybe fear. Instead, I saw a man watching the steel jaws of a bear trap snap shut around his ankle. The color drained from his face entirely, leaving his tan skin looking gray and sickly. His eyes locked onto the two pink lines. He stopped breathing. I watched the pulse in his neck flutter wildly. He was trapped, and he knew it. Oh my God, my mother breathed out, her hands flying to her mouth. Madison, are you? I'm pregnant. Madison choked out, burying her face in Declan's shoulder. She began to sob, delicate, feminine little hiccups. My mother was out of her chair in a flash, rushing around the table to envelop Madison in a fierce hug. My father broke out into a booming laugh, slapping his hand on the table, making the wine glasses shake. Well, I'll be damned. A grandfather. Declan, my boy, congratulations. My father reached across the table to shake Declan's hand. Declan stared at the outstretched hand for a long, agonizing second, before slowly reaching out and gripping it. Thank you, sir, Declan said. His voice was hollow. It sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well. We'll need to start planning. My mother was babbling now, stroking Madison's hair. "A wedding before you start showing too much." "Oh, Arthur, we need to call the country club tomorrow." "Hazel," my father barked, looking at me. I hadn't moved. I was sitting perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap. "Aren't you going to congratulate your sister? In my past life, this was the exact moment I ruined everything." I had stood up, knocking my chair backward. I had pointed at Madison and shouted that it was a lie, that I had seen her browsing pregnant forums for symptoms, that she was trying to chain Declan down. I remembered how Declan had looked at me then. His initial shock had morphed into disgust. He had wrapped his arm defensively around Madison, looking at me like I was insane. My mother had yelled at me to get out. The memory burned in my chest, a hot, branding iron of humiliation. I blinked, returning to the present. I looked at Madison. She was peeking at me from over our mother's shoulder, a silent, vicious challenge in her eyes. "Do it," her eyes said. "Make a scene. Make me the victim." I smiled. It felt tight, pulling painfully at the corners of my mouth. I picked up my wine glass and raised it toward the couple. "Congratulations, Maddie," I said, my voice smooth, quiet, and completely devoid of warmth. "I'm sure you two will have exactly the future you deserve." Declan finally looked at me. His dark eyes met mine across the table. For a second, just a fraction of a second, I saw a desperate plea in his gaze. He felt the wrongness of the situation. He felt the heavy, suffocating weight of the lie, even if he didn't know it was a lie yet. He was looking at me like he was drowning. I took a slow sip of my wine, maintaining eye contact with him, and let him sink. 6 weeks later, the lie was starting to require physical props. Madison was a performer, but biology is notoriously uncooperative with fiction. You can only complain about morning sickness and fatigue for so long before people expect to see some physical evidence. I found out about the prop on a humid Tuesday evening. I had come back to the apartment after a long shift at the design firm. The air conditioning was broken again, and the apartment smelled faintly of mildew and Madison's overwhelming strawberry vape. I walked past her bedroom door, which was left slightly ajar. I stopped. Madison was standing in front of her full-length mirror, wearing only a pair of black leggings and a sports bra. In her hands, she held a heavy, flesh-colored slab of silicone. It looked like an oversized, flattened chicken breast, with straps attached to the sides. I watched through the crack in the door as she strapped it around her waist, adjusting the buckle behind her back. She pulled a maternity blouse over her head, the fabric draped over the silicone, giving her the distinct, unmistakable bump of a woman entering her second trimester. She turned sideways, resting a hand lovingly on the fake stomach, and smiled at her reflection. A wave of nausea hit me so hard I had to grab the doorframe. The sheer, sociopathic dedication to the bit was horrifying. It was one thing to fake a pee stick. It was another, entirely, to strap a prosthetic to your body and parade it around town. The floorboard beneath my foot creaked. Madison spun around, her eyes wide, panic flashing across her features before settling into defensive anger. "Do you know how to knock?" she snapped, grabbing a cardigan from her bed and pulling it around herself, though it did nothing to hide the bump. I pushed the door open completely and leaned against the frame, crossing my arms. I let my eyes drift down to her stomach, then back up to her face. "I live here," I said flatly, and the door was open. She glared at me, her chest heaving. "What do you want, Hazel?" "Nothing. Just got home." I didn't look away from her stomach. The silence stretched between us, thick and oppressive. The hum of a distant siren drifted through the open window. "Stop looking at me like that," she hissed. "Like what?" Like I'm crazy." She took a step toward me, lowering her voice. "You think I want to do this? It's for the baby's future. Once we're married, I'll have a miscarriage. It happens all the time, tragically. Declan will be heartbroken, but we'll already be bonded. We'll be husband and wife. He won't leave me then." The cold calculus of it was stunning. I looked at the golden child of the Miller family, the girl who had never been told no in her entire life, and realized she was completely untethered from reality. "I didn't say a word, Maddie," I replied, pushing off the doorframe. "It's your body, or, well, your silicone. Just remember to wash it with warm water and mild soap. You don't want it to degrade before the wedding." I turned and walked to my room, locking the door behind me. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the wall. My hands were shaking again. I pulled my knees to my chest, breathing through the tight anxiety. "Let her dig," I reminded myself. "Just let her dig." The wedding preparations escalated into a fever pitch. My mother practically lived at the country club, obsessing over floral arrangements and tasting menus. Declan paid for everything without a single complaint, signing checks with a dead-eyed exhaustion that made him look 10 years older. The bridal shower was held on the outdoor patio of the club. It was late July by then, the heat thick and sticky. Pastel pink balloons bobbed listlessly in the stagnant air. I stood near the edge of the patio, holding a glass of cheap champagne that tasted like battery acid. The smell of the vanilla fondant from the massive cake was making me nauseous. Madison sat in a wicker chair that resembled a throne, surrounded by boxes of baby clothes and expensive silver rattles. She was wearing a tight white dress that proudly displayed the silicone bump. She was glowing, laughing as she held up a tiny pair of designer infant shoes. "Oh, Declan is going to die when he sees these," she cooed, passing them to one of her bridesmaids. I scanned the crowd. Declan's mother, Eleanor Hayes, was sitting a few feet away from Madison. Eleanor was a terrifying woman, sharp as a diamond and twice as hard. She sat perfectly straight, a cup of tea in her hand, staring unblinking at Madison's stomach. Eleanor wasn't smiling. Her eyes narrowed infinitesimally. She was calculating. Women who have actually been pregnant know how a body moves. They know how the center of gravity shifts, how the skin stretches, how a woman subconsciously protects a real, kicking child. Madison moved like a woman wearing a backpack backwards. I took a slow sip of my champagne. Tick-tock, Maddie, needing to escape the suffocating smell of perfume and fondant. I slipped through the glass doors into the club's deserted lounge. I walked out the opposite side, stepping onto the shaded back terrace overlooking the golf course. I dug into my purse and pulled out a cigarette. It was a filthy habit I had picked up in the bitter, lonely months of my past life, before the crash. I hadn't smoked since I woke up in this life, but today, I needed the burn. I flicked the lighter. The flame flared, loud in the quiet afternoon. "I didn't know you smoked." I jumped, dropping the lighter. It clattered against the stone pavers. Declan was sitting on a wrought iron bench in the shadows, a heavy crystal tumbler of whiskey in his hand. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket, and his tie was pulled loose. He looked exhausted. Dark circles hung under his eyes, and his jaw was shadowed with stubble. I slowly bent down, picked up the lighter, and lit the cigarette. I took a deep drag, the acrid smoke filling my lungs, grounding me. "There's a lot of things you don't know about me, Declan," I said, leaning against the stone railing. He took a slow sip of his whiskey, staring out at the manicured green lawns. True enough, we sat in silence for a long time. The faint, shrill sound of women laughing drifted through the building from the shower on the other side. Declan flinched slightly at the sound. "She looks happy," he said quietly. It wasn't a statement of joy. It was an observation, detached and bleak. "She loves a party," I replied, tapping the ash over the railing. Declan turned to look at me. His dark eyes were heavy, searching my face for something. A life raft, maybe. "Hazel, can I ask you something?" "Shoot." He looked down at his glass, swirling the amber liquid. "Has Madison always been this delicate? She says the doctor wants her on bed rest soon. She says the pain is excruciating. But sometimes, when she doesn't think I'm looking..." He trailed off, his jaw tightening. He was starting to see the cracks in the glass, the little slips in Madison's performance, the way she would bend completely in half to pick up a dropped phone, something physically impossible for a woman 4 months pregnant. He was begging me, silently, to give him an answer, to give him an out. I looked at him, the man who had looked at me with such venom when I tried to tell him the truth, the man who had blindly believed the golden child. I took another drag of my cigarette, the cherry burning bright red. I exhaled the smoke slowly, watching it dissipate in the thick summer air. "Pregnancy is different for everyone, Declan," I said smoothly, my voice void of any emotion. "You just have to trust her." He looked away, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his invisible chains. "Right. Trust." I crushed the cigarette out on the stone, turned my back on him, and walked inside. I was leaving him in the dark, because the brighter the spotlight when the truth finally came out, the more spectacular the crash was going to be. The bridal boutique smelled aggressively of lavender and ozone, the kind of sterile, high-end clean that made my sinuses ache. I sat on a velvet-tufted sofa, a glass of complimentary sparkling water sweating in my hand. In front of me, standing on a circular pedestal surrounded by mirrored walls, was Madison. She was encased in $10,000 of ivory silk and French lace, and a very thick, very unyielding layer of silicone. "Breathe in, Miss Miller." The seamstress, a small woman with a mouthful of pins, mumbled around the metal. She yanked the fabric tighter around Madison's waist. Madison flinched, her knuckles turning white where she gripped the skirts. "Careful, I don't want too much pressure on the baby." "Of course." The seamstress apologized quickly, loosening the tape measure. Sitting on the sofa opposite me was Eleanor Hayes. Declan's mother wore a tailored charcoal suit that looked sharper than the seamstress's pins. She hadn't touched the tea she'd been offered. Her pale blue eyes were fixed on Madison's midsection with the unblinking intensity of a hawk watching a field mouse. "You're carrying very high, Madison," Eleanor noted. Her voice was like smooth glass, perfectly clear, completely rigid. Madison's neck flushed red. The blotches crept up past her jawline. "My doctor says every woman carries differently, Mrs. Hayes." "Oh, absolutely. I carried Declan quite low. He was heavy, settled right into the pelvis by the 5th month." Eleanor tilted her head, her bob perfectly stationary. "Does he kick much?" Declan was a terror, kept me up all night. I watched a bead of sweat gather at Madison's temple. She couldn't wipe it without ruining her makeup. The lie was a living, breathing thing now, demanding constant feeding, constant attention. It was exhausting her. I could see the dark circles under her foundation, the slight tremor in her hands. "He kicks," Madison said, her voice a pitch too high. Mostly when I'm trying to sleep. Declan felt it the other night. That was a lie. I knew Declan had been sleeping in the guest room of his own apartment for 2 weeks. Madison had complained to our mother about it over the phone, citing his pre-wedding jitters. How wonderful! Eleanor smiled. It didn't reach her eyes. She stood up smoothly, the wool of her suit barely making a sound. She walked toward the pedestal. May I? She reached out a manicured hand, palm open, toward the tight silk stretching over the silicone dome. The air in the boutique stopped moving. The seamstress paused, a pin hovering in midair. I slowly lowered my glass of sparkling water to my lap. Madison froze. Pure, unadulterated terror blasted across her features. If Eleanor touched that stomach, if she pressed down with any amount of force, she wouldn't feel the firm, taut muscle in fluid of a pregnant belly. She would feel dense, spongy rubber. Madison stammered, taking a jerky half-step backward on the pedestal. The silk hissed. He's sleeping. I don't want to wake him. Eleanor's hand hung in the air for one terrible, elongated second. The silence was deafening. I felt a phantom twinge in my crushed ribs, a ghost from my previous life, reminding me of the price of crossing this family. Then, Eleanor gracefully lowered her hand, tucking a stray thread on the dress instead. Of course, Eleanor murmured softly. A mother's instinct. It's so fierce, isn't it? Yes, Madison gasped, a desperate, breathless sound. Fierce. Eleanor turned to me, her sharp eyes flicking over my dark jeans and oversized sweater. And you, Hazel, you must be so thrilled to become an aunt. You two are so close. I met Eleanor's gaze. She was testing the waters with me too, checking the perimeter for weaknesses. In my last life, I had broken down here. I had pleaded with Eleanor privately in the dressing room, sobbing, telling her Madison was lying. Eleanor had looked at me with pity and disgust, dismissing me as a jealous, unstable sibling, exactly as Madison had preconditioned her to do. Thrilled isn't the word, I said evenly, letting a small, placid smile touch my lips. It's an absolute miracle. Eleanor stared at me for a heartbeat longer. A miracle indeed. She turned back to her seat, smoothing her skirt. Madison caught my eye in the mirror. For a fraction of a second, I saw raw hatred flash in her reflection. She knew I was mocking her, but she couldn't say a word. She was trapped on her pedestal, wrapped in white, sweating under the lights of her own making. 3 weeks before the wedding, the Hayes family lawyers summoned us to a conference room in a high-rise downtown. The air conditioning was aggressive, and the room smelled distinctly of polished mahogany and bitter espresso. I was only there because my father insisted. He viewed the marriage as a corporate merger, and he wanted the whole family united. To show Declan's people we were serious, I sat at the far end of the long glass table, tracing the condensation on my water glass with my index finger. Declan looked awful. The sharp angles of his face had hollowed out. He wore a charcoal suit that hung slightly looser on his frame than it had a month ago. He was staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city skyline, completely detached from the quiet hum of the lawyers shuffling thick stacks of paper. Madison sat next to him, wearing a loose maternity blouse and a practiced expression of innocent fatigue. She rested a hand on her fake stomach, a gesture that had become an automated tick. "We've reviewed the amendments, Mr. Hayes." My father, Arthur, boomed, adjusting his tie. He was trying to sound like he belonged in this room of generational wealth. He didn't, The trust provisions seem standard. They are. Arthur, said Mr. Sterling. Wait, no, I needed to forget those old names, said Mr. Caldwell, the lead attorney for the Hayes family. An older man with wire-rimmed glasses and a voice like dry leaves. However, there is one stipulation Eleanor Hayes insisted we clarify in Section 4, subsection B. He slid a heavy, cream-colored document across the glass table toward Madison and Declan. Declan didn't even look at it. He kept staring at the skyline. Madison leaned forward, her eyes catching the light. She was hungry for the numbers. I knew how much she had Googled Declan's net worth. Subsection B, Caldwell read aloud, tapping his gold pen against the paper. In the event of a dissolution of the marriage within the first 5 years, the spousal support payout is strictly capped. However, the trust allocation for the child, he paused, looking directly at Madison, is contingent upon a live birth and a verified paternity test administered by a mutually agreed-upon medical facility. The clicking of a pen somewhere down the table sounded like a gunshot. Madison's hand, resting on her silicone bump, twitched. I watched the muscles in her jaw lock. She was arrogant, but she wasn't completely stupid. She understood what that meant. If she had a tragic miscarriage after the wedding, as was her plan, she wouldn't see a dime of the Hayes family trust. She would only get the capped spousal support, a fraction of the fortune she was aiming for. And if she magically produced a baby, the paternity test would destroy her. She was cornered. A paternity test? My mother, Beatrice, gasped, clutching her pearls. The outrage was genuine. That is incredibly insulting. Declan, are you questioning Madison's loyalty? Declan finally turned away from the window. His eyes were flat, deadened. He looked at my mother, then down at the papers. It wasn't my request, Beatrice. It's standard family protocol for the primary trust. I won't have my daughter treated like some gold digger. My father blustered, his face turning puce. I leaned back in my leather chair. The leather creaked loudly in the tense room. Dad, I said, my voice cutting through the noise. Everyone looked at me. I kept my posture relaxed, my hands steepled in my lap. It's standard protocol, I repeated smoothly, looking right at Madison. And besides, Maddie has nothing to hide. Right, Maddie? It's just ink on a page. Madison stared at me. Her chest was rising and falling too fast. She felt the noose tightening. She had thought a fake positive test and a few tears were a golden ticket. She didn't realize the Hayes family didn't write checks based on tears. They wrote them based on blood. But if she refused to sign, the wedding was off. Declan would walk. The lie would implode right here, right now, with no payday and maximum humiliation. She swallowed hard. She looked at Declan, who was watching her with an unreadable expression. I'll sign it, Madison whispered. Madison, no! My mother hissed. I'll sign it, she repeated, her voice gaining a brittle, desperate edge. She snatched the gold pen from the table. I love Declan. I don't care about the money. I just want our family. She signed her name with aggressive, jagged strokes. The ink bled slightly into the thick parchment. I watched the signature dry. She had just locked herself in a burning building, hoping she could find a fire extinguisher before the roof collapsed. The inevitable panic attack came 2 weeks later, disguised as a medical emergency. My phone vibrated violently against my nightstand at 2:14 a.m. I jolted awake, the lingering smell of burning rubber from a nightmare instantly replaced by the stale, dusty air of my bedroom. Hazel, my mother's voice was hysterical. Meet us at St. Jude's emergency room. It's Madison. She's bleeding. I sat up slowly. My bare feet hit the cold floorboards. I didn't rush. I pulled on a pair of sweatpants, brushed my teeth, and drove the speed limit to the hospital. The midnight air was muggy, clinging to my skin like wet cellophane. By the time I walked through the sliding glass doors of the ER, the sterile smell of rubbing alcohol and cheap floor wax hit me like a physical blow. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly, greenish pallor over the waiting room. I found them in Bay 4. Declan was pacing outside the curtain, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. His hair was messy, and he was wearing a wrinkled t-shirt. When he saw me, he stopped pacing, his shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch. "What happened?" I asked, keeping my voice hushed. "She woke up screaming," Declan said, his voice ragged. He rubbed a hand over his face, said there was blood, cramping. "I brought her straight here." I looked at the closed curtain. "Where is she?" "In there. The nurse is prepping her. They're waiting for the on-call OBGYN to bring the ultrasound machine." My stomach plummeted, but not out of sympathy. An ultrasound. You can't ultrasound silicone. You can't put cold blue gel on a prosthetic and pretend you're finding a heartbeat. If that machine touched her stomach, it was over, but it wouldn't be on my terms. It would just be a messy, pathetic end in a curtained ER bay. I pushed past Declan and slid the curtain back. Madison was lying on the narrow, crinkly paper of the examination table. She was wearing a hospital gown, her knees pulled up to her chest, sobbing hysterically. A young, tired-looking nurse was standing next to the bed, holding a plastic bottle of blue gel. "Miss Miller, I need you to lie flat and lower the blanket," the nurse said, her tone professional but strained. "The doctor will be here in 2 minutes. We need to check the fetal heartbeat." "No!" Madison shrieked, clutching the blanket tighter to her chest. She was hyperventilating, real tears streaking her mascara down her face. She looked at me, her eyes wild, cornered. She was still wearing the prosthetic under the gown. I could see the bulky, unnatural squareness of it beneath the thin cotton. She had strapped it on before the ambulance arrived. Dedication to the bitter end. "I want my doctor," Madison cried. "I want Dr. Evans. I won't let some random ER doctor touch my baby." "Dr. Evans isn't affiliated with this hospital, ma'am." The nurse sighed, clearly losing her patience. "If you are bleeding, we need to locate the source and check the fetus." "Don't touch me." Declan stepped into the bay behind me. "Madison, please, just let them look. We need to know if the baby is okay." His voice broke on the word baby. He wanted it to be real. Despite the trap, despite the coldness, a part of him was mourning a child that didn't exist. I looked at Madison. She was shaking violently, her knuckles white as bone where she gripped the blanket. If she refused the ultrasound, Declan would know. The nurse would flag her as a psychiatric risk. The lie would die here, in a sterile room, with a whimper. I wanted it to die in front of a crowd. I wanted her to fall from the highest possible altitude. I stepped forward, grabbing the foot of the bed. The metal was cold against my palms. "Nurse," I said. My voice was low, authoritative, and completely devoid of the panic everyone else in the room was displaying. The nurse looked at me. "Are you family?" "I'm her sister," I said. I didn't look at Madison. I looked directly into the nurse's tired eyes. She has severe medical trauma, extreme hapophobia. If you force that machine on her right now, her blood pressure will spike to a critical level. You're going to put her into shock. The nurse frowned, looking down at Madison, who was legitimately hyperventilating now, gasping for air. She reported vaginal bleeding, the nurse countered. I have to follow protocol. Has she bled since she got here? I asked quickly, sharply. The nurse hesitated. No, the pad is clean, because there was no blood. There never was. Then she's stabilizing. I lied, smoothly. It was likely a sympathetic cramp or round ligament pain, exacerbated by stress. She needs to calm down, not be held down for a scan she is explicitly refusing. I turned to Declan. Declan, step outside. You're suffocating her. Declan looked at me, stunned by my sudden command. He looked at Madison, who was crying silently now, rocking back and forth. Slowly, he backed out of the bay. I turned back to the nurse. Give us 5 minutes. If her vitals don't drop, we're signing out AMA. We will see her private OBGYN at 8 a.m. when the clinic opens. The nurse stared at me, calculating the liability. Finally, she set the bottle of blue gel down on the counter with a hard thwack. 5 minutes, then I'm bringing the discharge papers against medical advice. But this is on you. She pushed past me and yanked the curtain shut. Silence descended on the small cubicle, save for the rhythmic, jarring beep of the heart monitor. I stood at the foot of the bed, staring at my sister. Madison slowly stopped rocking. She lowered the blanket an inch, looking at me with a mixture of profound relief and absolute terror. She knew I wasn't saving her. She knew I had just walked her off the ledge, right back into the burning building. Why did you do that? She whispered, her voice trembling. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cold metal rail of the bed. The smell of rubbing alcohol burned my nose. Because, I said softly, a slow, dark smile spreading across my face. Your wedding is in 4 days, Madison, and you're going to walk down that aisle. The bridal suite at the country club smelled intensely of aerosol hairspray, white lilies, and anxious sweat. It was a suffocating combination. The lilies, massive white blooms, stuffed into every corner of the room, reminded me of funeral arrangements. My funeral, the one none of them had bothered to attend in my past life. I sat on a velvet ottoman in the corner, nursing a lukewarm mimosa, watching the machinery of a high society wedding operate at full tilt. 4 makeup artists hovered around Madison like mechanics over a luxury sports car. Everyone out, Madison snapped suddenly. Her voice was brittle, cracking slightly at the edges. The artist froze, brushes suspended in the air. I said, get out. I need 5 minutes with my sister. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at the door. Within seconds, the room emptied, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind the last assistant. The silence that followed was heavy, ringing in my ears. Madison slumped against the edge of the vanity, her perfectly coiled blonde hair jarring against her hunched, defeated posture. She was wearing a silk bridal robe, but it hung open, revealing the thick, flesh-toned silicone strapped around her waist. Lock the door, she whispered. I set my glass down. The condensation left a dark ring on the mahogany table. I walked over and threw the deadbolt. Click. Help me, she gasped, her hands fumbling blindly at her back. Hazel, please. It burns. I walked up behind her. She moved her arms, and I saw what she meant. The relentless summer heat, combined with the heavy prosthetic she had been wearing for 16 hours a day, had taken a brutal toll. The edges of the thick silicone had rubbed her skin entirely raw. A thick, angry red rash wrapped around her lower back and hips, the skin broken and weeping in several places. Blisters had formed where the heavy Velcro straps dug into her ribs. It looked painful, viscerally, sickeningly painful. A tiny, deeply buried part of me, the older sister who used to bandage her scraped knees when we were kids, felt a flicker of genuine pity. It was a biological response to seeing family in pain. But then I took a breath, and my lungs protested. The ghost of the steering wheel pressing into my sternum flared up, a phantom ache that stole the air from my throat. I remembered the cold asphalt. I remembered the absolute certainty that she had left me to die to protect her trust fund. The pity evaporated, replaced by a cold, clinical detachment. "You're bleeding, Maddie," I said softly, my voice betraying nothing. "I know," she sobbed, burying her face in her hands. "It hurts so much. Every time I move, the friction, it's tearing my skin off. I can't do this, Hazel. I can't wear it under the dress. The corset is too tight. It's going to squeeze the blisters." She turned to look at me. Her makeup was flawless, a mask of glowing bridal joy, but her eyes were terrified, hollow, and feral. "Then take it off," I said. She stared at me, uncomprehending. "Take it off, walk out there, and tell Declan the truth," I continued, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. "Tell him you lied. Tell his mother you lied. Tell Mom and Dad." "I can't," she hissed, taking a step toward me. The silicone shifted, and she let out a sharp gasp of pain, clutching her side. "The prenup, Hazel. The trust. If I tell them now, they'll destroy me. Declan will leave me at the altar. Mom and Dad will be a laughingstock. The Hayes family will sue us for the wedding costs." She was hyperventilating, the shallow breaths making her chest heave. "I'm going to miscarry tonight," she whispered, her eyes wide, plotting wildly. "During the reception, after the vows, after the papers are signed, I'm going to slip in the bathroom, or I'll just collapse on the dance floor. It has to be today. I can't wear this thing for another week. I'll get an infection." "A reception miscarriage," I mused, tilting my head. "Dramatic, very you." "Help me pad the straps," she begged, ignoring my tone. "Please, use the gauze from the emergency kit, just so I can survive the ceremony." I looked at the weeping skin on her hips. I looked at the heavy, lifeless rubber strapped to her body. She had built her own torture device, piece by piece, lie by lie. I picked up the roll of white medical gauze from the vanity counter. "Lift your arms," I instructed. She obeyed, tears leaking from the corners of her eyes. I methodically wrapped the soft white cotton over the bloody blisters, creating a barrier between her raw skin and the unforgiving Velcro. I taped it down smoothly. "Better?" I asked. "Yes," she breathed out, a shuddering sigh of relief. "Thank you. God, Hazel, thank you. I know we haven't always. I know I've been a bitch. But I won't forget this." Neither will I thought. I stepped back as she pulled the silk robe shut over the hideous contraption. A sharp knock rapped against the heavy oak door. "5 minutes, Madison," my mother's voice trilled from the hallway. "Eleanor is here to give you something before you walk down the aisle." Madison's eyes widened. She quickly swiped a tissue under her eyes, plastering on a radiant, serene smile that made my stomach churn. She unlocked the door and pulled it open. Eleanor Hayes stepped into the room. She was wearing a deep navy gown that looked like it had been woven from shadows. Her posture was flawless. She held a small, black velvet box in her hands. "Madison," Eleanor said, her voice dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. "You look resilient." "Thank you, Eleanor," Madison beamed. placing her requisite hand over the silicone bump. Eleanor's pale eyes tracked the movement. She didn't blink. "I brought you the Hayes family pearls," Eleanor continued, opening the box. Nestled inside was a string of massive, luminous pearls. They are worn by the women of this family on their wedding day. They symbolize purity, honesty, and the continuation of our bloodline. The words hung in the air, heavy and pointed. Madison swallowed hard, her throat bobbing. "I am so honored. Let me put them on you," Eleanor offered, taking a step forward. Madison turned around, lifting her hair. Eleanor stood behind her, fastening the cold clasp against the nape of Madison's neck. As she did, Eleanor's knuckles brushed against the fabric of Madison's robe, right over her spine, exactly where the thick Velcro strap of the silicone belly fastened beneath the silk. I watched Eleanor's hand pause, just for a fraction of a second. Her fingers pressed slightly against the unnatural, rigid bulk hidden beneath the delicate fabric. Eleanor met my eyes in the vanity mirror. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She simply looked at me with the cold, absolute clarity of an apex predator who had just confirmed the scent of blood in the water. "Perfect," Eleanor said softly, stepping back. "We will see you at the altar, Madison." As Eleanor swept out of the room, I looked down at my hands. They weren't shaking anymore. The country club ballroom was a cathedral of excess. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over 200 guests. The air was thick with the scent of roasted duck, expensive champagne, and the suffocating perfume of wealth. They had said their vows. They had signed the marriage certificate in the rectory. Madison was officially a Hayes. I sat at the head table, pushing a piece of asparagus around my china plate. A few seats down, Declan sat stiffly beside his new wife. He had drank 3 glasses of whiskey in rapid succession since arriving at the reception. He wasn't looking at Madison. He was staring blankly at the massive, 5-tier wedding cake across the room. Madison was vibrating with nervous energy. The gauze I had applied was likely soaked through by now. The corset of her ridiculously heavy French lace gown was pressing the silicone deep into her raw skin. She kept shifting in her seat, wincing slightly. It was time. She was going to make her move. I watched her lean over to Declan, whispering something in his ear. She placed a hand on her stomach, her face twisting in a practiced mask of agony. Declan frowned, leaning closer. "What? Maddie, what is it?" I don't feel well," she gasped, loud enough for the microphone on the nearby podium to catch a faint, breathy echo of it. "Declan, something's wrong. The baby." My mother, sitting on the other side of Madison, dropped her fork. "Madison? Sweetheart?" Madison stood up. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. She looked out at the crowded ballroom, ensuring all eyes were drifting toward the head table. She timed it perfectly with the lull in the string quartet's music. "It hurts!" Madison cried out, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the low hum of conversation. The ballroom went completely, instantly silent. Madison took one step away from the table, buckled her knees, and collapsed onto the polished oak dance floor. She curled into a fetal position, screaming, clutching her stomach with both hands. It was an Oscar-worthy performance. She writhed, her white lace dress tangling around her legs, her face buried in the floorboards as she sobbed hysterically. "Madison!" Declan shouted, his chair crashing backward as he dropped to his knees beside her. "Maddie, look at me. Somebody call an ambulance." My mother was shrieking. My father was yelling at the catering staff. The guests were standing up, murmuring in a rising tide of panic. But I didn't look at Madison. I looked at Eleanor Hayes. Eleanor was sitting perfectly still at her table, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She wasn't surprised. She wasn't panicked. She raised a single finger into the air. Before the country club manager could even pull out his phone to dial 911, the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom burst open. 3 people in dark navy, EMS uniforms, rushed into the room, carrying a heavy red trauma bag and a portable gurney. They hadn't been called. They had been waiting. "Clear the area," the lead EMT barked, a large, broad-shouldered man with a severe buzz cut. "We have a private medical concierge unit on standby. Everyone step back." My parents backed away, breathless with relief. "Oh, thank God," my mother wept, clinging to my father. They were already here. Declan held Madison's shoulders, his face pale with genuine terror. "Help her," he begged the EMTs. "She's pregnant. She's saying she's losing the baby." Madison, still curled on the floor, suddenly stopped writhing. Through her fake sobs, she realized what was happening. These weren't regular paramedics. She couldn't control them. She couldn't tell them to just put her in an ambulance so she could miscarry in private. The lead EMT dropped to his knees beside her, unzipping the red trauma bag with a harsh, metallic sound. "Ma'am, I need you to lie flat," he ordered, his voice clipped and entirely unbothered by her screaming. "No!" Madison shrieked, suddenly fighting back. She kicked out, her heel catching the paramedic in the shin. "Don't touch me. I want my doctor. I want to go to a private hospital." "Maddie, stop!" Declan yelled, pinning her shoulders down. "They have to help you. You're bleeding." "I'm fine. Get off me." She was thrashing wildly now, not the movements of a woman in crippling uterine pain, but the frantic, panicked flailing of a trapped animal. "Patient is combative, possible hypovolemic shock," the lead EMT said to his partner. "We need to check fetal distress immediately. Get the Doppler and the shears." The second paramedic pulled out a heavy pair of curved, metal trauma shears. Madison's eyes locked onto the scissors. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking like a wax corpse. "No," she whispered. The fake sobbing stopped entirely. "No, please, don't cut the dress. It's French lace. Please." "Hold her down, sir," the EMT said to Declan. Declan, operating purely on adrenaline in fear for his unborn child, leaned his weight across Madison's arms, pinning her flat against the floorboards. "I'm sorry, Maddie," Declan choked out, tears in his eyes. "They have to check the baby." "Declan, stop them," she screamed, a raw, guttural sound that tore at her vocal cords. It wasn't acting anymore. It was pure, unadulterated terror. "Don't let them look. I'm begging you." The paramedic grabbed the thick, intricate lacework at the collar of her expensive gown. Snip! The sound of the heavy shears, biting through the fabric, was impossibly loud in the silent ballroom. Snip, snip, snip. He cut straight down the center of the bodice, ruining $10,000 of silk and pearl embroidery in less than 3 seconds. He grabbed the severed edges of the dress and ripped them violently apart to expose her abdomen. The entire ballroom gasped in unison. It wasn't a soft, rounded pregnant belly. Under the bright, unforgiving glare of the crystal chandeliers, the prosthetic lay fully exposed. It was a dense, opaque mound of flesh-colored silicone, strapped firmly to her waist with thick, heavy-duty, beige Velcro straps. The edges of the rubber were stained with blood and yellow fluid from her blistered skin, making it look horrific and grotesque. The paramedic froze, the trauma shears slipping slightly in his grip. Declan, kneeling over her, stopped breathing. He stared down at the dense rubber slab resting over his wife's stomach. He blinked once, twice. His brain simply refused to process the visual information. He slowly reached out a shaking, hesitant hand. His fingers touched the silicone. It was cold, firm, and entirely synthetic. Madison lay pinned beneath him, her ruined dress splayed out on the floor, the ugly straps of her deception digging into her raw skin for everyone to see. She stared up at the ceiling, her chest heaving, trapped in the absolute center of her own destruction. I had expected someone to scream. I had expected my mother to faint, or my father to bellow in rage. But there was only silence. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum that swallowed the entire ballroom. 200 people, dressed in tuxedos and evening gowns, stood paralyzed, staring at the woman on the floor and the piece of medical-grade rubber strapped to her waist. The silence dragged on for 5, 10, 15 agonizing seconds. The only sound was the jagged, ragged sound of Declan's breathing. He didn't pull his hand away from the silicone. He just kept his fingertips resting on it, as if waiting for a fake heartbeat to pulse through the rubber. Slowly, agonizingly, he lifted his head. He looked at Madison. The grief and panic that had contorted his face only seconds before melted away, replaced by an absolute, devastating emptiness. It was the look of a man who had just realized his entire reality was a hallucination. "Declan," Madison whispered. Her voice was weak, pathetic. She tried to pull the ruined flaps of her dress over the silicone, but her hands were shaking too violently. "Declan, I can explain. Please." Declan stood up. His movements were slow, robotic. He wiped the hand that had touched the prosthetic on the leg of his tuxedo trousers, a gesture of profound disgust. He didn't yell. He didn't curse at her. He just turned his back on her and started walking. He walked past the paramedics, past my paralyzed parents, past the head table. He pushed through the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom and disappeared into the night. "Declan!" Madison shrieked, trying to scramble up, but her high heels slipped on the polished wood. She fell hard onto her hands and knees, the heavy silicone belly dragging her down, looking utterly grotesque. "Wait! Declan!" My mother finally broke the spell. She let out a low, keen wail, pressing her hands over her face, turning away from the sight of her golden child. My father simply stared, his jaw slack, the ruddy color completely drained from his cheeks. The corporate merger he had banked on was dead. His reputation was incinerated. Eleanor Hayes stood up slowly from her table. She smoothed the front of her navy gown, entirely unruffled. "I believe," Eleanor said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent room, "this reception has concluded. The catering staff will validate your parking." She turned and walked out, following her son's path. The paramedics, realizing there was no medical emergency, quietly packed up their trauma bag and backed out of the room, leaving Madison entirely alone in the center of the dance floor. The guests began to scatter. It wasn't an orderly exit. It was a quiet, frantic mass exodus. People averted their eyes, whispering furiously, grabbing their purses and coats. Nobody wanted to be in the blast radius of this level of humiliation. I sat at the head table, taking a slow sip of my flat champagne. It tasted metallic, like pennies. Madison was still on the floor, surrounded by the discarded, ruined silk of her dress. The red, Weeping blisters on her sides were fully exposed to the cold air of the ballroom. She looked up and caught my eye. Her mascara had run completely down her face, leaving thick, black tracks over her pale cheeks. The absolute terror in her eyes had been replaced by something hollow and broken. She knew. Looking at me, sitting perfectly calm amidst the wreckage of her life, she finally knew. I hadn't stopped her. I had handed her the hammer, pointed her at the glass house, and watched her swing. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I felt nothing at all. The phantom pain in my chest, the crushing weight of the steering wheel, the freezing rain, the absolute loneliness of dying, hated by my family, finally, quietly, ceased. I stood up. I didn't look at my weeping mother or my catatonic father. I picked up my clutch purse from the table. I walked down the steps of the dais, my heels clicking sharply against the wood. I walked right past Madison, not stopping, not looking down. I pushed through the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the humid, summer night air. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with oxygen that was finally, truly mine. The lie was dead. The debt was paid. And for the first time in a year, I was truly alive. Revenge isn't loud. Sometimes it's just the deafening silence of letting someone destroy themselves. Hazel walked away from the wreckage of her family without a single backward glance, leaving Madison trapped in a prison of her own silicone and lies. Did Hazel go too far, or did Madison get exactly what she deserved for her sociopathic manipulation? If you love this deep dive into karma, psychological warfare, and raw family betrayal, hit that like button right now. Share this story with someone who loves a dark, dramatic payoff. And make sure to subscribe so you never miss another video.